event. I'm Tony Barber, and contrary to what it says up here, I have never worked for The Guardian in my life. That's not to say I might not have. No, I'm not going to go down that road. No, I worked for the Financial Times for a lot of my career. And before that, Reuters, and I used to write about Europe. So that's me. But more importantly, to my left, I have Thomas Bagger, who is the recently arrived, I have to say, ambassador of Germany in Italy, but has an immense experience in the subjects that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Over to my extreme right over there is Martin Briand, who's the ambassador of France in Italy, not so recently arrived, I think longer here. And to my immediate right, Antonio Villafranca, sorry, Salvatore De Vita, my apologies, Salvatore De Vita, who is, it says, economic advisor at the Italian representation. This is in Brussels, isn't it? Oh, for the European Commission in Rome, yes, of course. And we may possibly be joined by Nicola Varola, who is the Director General for European Trade Policy for the Italian government, and also Antonio Villafranca, who is Director of Research at the Italian Institute of International Political Studies in Milan. So the topic, as you can see up there, is challenges to the European strategic autonomy. I stress that word "the" because I think if you removed the word "the," we might have a slightly clearer sense of what's going on here. It raises the question of whether European strategic autonomy is already a fact, or whether it's a work in progress, or whether it's an aspiration, an idea. There are different views on this, which we'll explore soon. Whatever definition it gets, the kind of issues it covers, I think, are well known. First and foremost, probably the question of defense and security, which is obviously extremely topical with the war in Ukraine, Russian behavior, not just in Ukraine, but increasingly all around Europe. The uncertainties in the transatlantic relationship, and of course also the question of Europe's relationship with China. So there's that side of it, but there's also a very important economic dimension. And one thought that crossed my mind was that in the days when I worked in Brussels some time ago, it was clear to myself and everyone who worked there that the European Union really was a powerhouse in areas like trade policy and business regulation. But here, 20 years on from that, it is more questionable whether that same kind of superpower status almost in those areas of trade and regulation is quite what it used to be. There's also the question regarding strategic autonomy of the democratic resilience, or the resilience of democracies in country by country around Europe, and they're under a lot of pressure from external forces, but they're also under pressure from internal forces as well. So the question is how the concept of strategic autonomy can address that. Enough from me. I am going to ask Thomas Bagger to my left here to open with a few remarks. We're going to have just some introductory statements from or thoughts on the subject from each of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up for as many questions as I can fit in before the end of the session. So let's get going.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Io sono il nuovo arrivato in Italy. I spent, I guess, 14 out of my last 15 years in diplomacy in Berlin, It's not what you sign up for when you become a diplomat, you want to go abroad. I spent most of my time in the ministry, and I witnessed something and took part in something that that sort of illustrates what Tony Barber has just outlined. In both dimensions, hard military security and economic security, we developed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Iron Curtain, completely different concepts. And on hard security, we were talking about the European security architecture and collective security, where one security would not come at the expense of the others, but it would be more of a collective enterprise through rules, regulations, and arms control. And on economic security, basically that word disappeared altogether, and it was all about efficiency. It was about just-in-time production chains. It was all about maximizing efficiency for maximizing profit. And it was all about interdependence, not just within Europe in the single market, but actually also between Europe and the outside world. And interdependence was considered to be a good thing because it would be a mutual, in a way, a mutual dependency that would also create stability. Or so the thinking went, not least in my own country. And so I think what we've discovered, and this is as much a mental challenge as it is a material or a policy challenge, is that this may have been true for a brief moment in history, but it can no longer govern the way we run our European Union or we behave as member states. We are challenged in hard security. That is pretty straightforward. We have understood we need to invest more in our own strength. So there's a big investment in military procurement, in military industries across Europe, in order to rebuild defenses and to reestablish deterrence. But for someone who is old enough like me to have witnessed the Cold War, you also understand that deterrence in the end is a product of two factors: capabilities and intentions or political will. So it's not just good enough to be materially able to defend yourself, you also have to be willing to defend yourself. And that's the big debate we're having, not least in Germany, about the reintroduction of conscription, the question of assistance to Ukraine, the question of how forcefully to confront Russia. I would argue that the mental challenge in the economic security field is maybe even bigger. It's greater, because we no longer look at economic relationships solely through the prism of efficiency and interdependence, but more through one-sided dependencies, vulnerabilities that we would like to reduce. We suddenly look at economic interaction in the same way we look at national security. If someone else gains more from an interaction than we do, this may be a bad thing, even though it would make us more wealthy. So we're looking at pressure points with some of our trading partners. We're looking to introduce screenings for foreign investment from countries where we have concerns. And that is not just Russia. Above all, for a country like Germany, but also for Europe, it is China. Because that is where we have the greatest trade imbalance. That's where we have the greatest dependencies, the greatest vulnerabilities. You've all heard about rare earth, raw materials, but a lot of other things as well, such as basic healthcare materials, as we all witnessed with the masks in the early days of the COVID pandemic. So in a way, we're in a process as Europe to give ourselves a harder shell again, as nation states, but also as a union. For a long time, this was more about civil society cooperation, company to company contacts. Now the states are reasserting themselves. And one of the big questions is, what is Europe's role as a union and what is the nation state's role? About the word strategic autonomy, I think it's important that we don't mix it up with a concept like autarky, where we are completely sort of self-reliant. This would make us poorer in a way that is hard to imagine even today. We all know that Europe has profited immensely from trade, from investment, from being linked to the rest of the world. So what we want to do is really to de-risk. It is to reduce vulnerabilities, or to be aware at least of the vulnerabilities of others. One of the more puzzling experiences that we're going through on a policy level is how this also affects our relationship with our traditionally most important partner, which is the United States, which has adopted a far more transactional approach, and where we can no longer be sure how reliable the American underwriting of European security really is. So what do we do about that relationship? In the broadest terms, and only by way of introduction now at the beginning, I would say it has become almost a dialectic relationship. In a way, how strongly America will stay attached to Europe will depend on the degree to which Europe is able to invest in its own strength to become more powerful and stronger itself. That is what makes it interesting for America. It is no longer sort of our lack of self-sufficiency in defense that makes us interesting as someone the United States would invest in, because it feels that that is in its own interest. So in a way, we're trying to adapt to a very different world, not one that is entirely unknown to us. I sometimes feel that some of the lessons that we're trying to learn in Brussels or in Berlin and elsewhere are actually lessons that we also learned in the 1980s, or that we knew about in the 1980s. But after 89, we chose to forget about them because it was convenient. And it was very convenient to spend less on defense and to worry more about profitability and efficiency. But if the environment is a different one that we operate in, we have to adapt again, and we have to relearn some of these lessons. And as I said, I think it's useful to think about it, not just in the military dimension, but as much also in this economic security dimension. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. First, thanks to the organizers, because I think it's a very timely event. I would like to make 5 quick points. The first one is on the strategic context. Well, I will not spend too much time on it because I think it is well characterized, but I will sum it up in 4 words. The first one is disinhibition. Today, lots of countries dare to do things that they wouldn't have done a few years ago, invading its neighbor, assassinating people in another country, cyber attacks, etc. Second word is fragmentation. Fragmentation of the global economy, fragmentation of the multilateral order. The third word is uncertainty. And what is really profoundly disturbing is that today the uncertainty extends to our closest partners. And Thomas talked about the US, for example. And the fourth word, which might be the most destabilizing, is acceleration. Things are going much faster. You have, for example, technological acceleration and acceleration of the technological race between China and the US, but also acceleration of a number of other evolutions, including climate change. I will just take a second to make an advertisement for the French National Strategic Review, which was published in July, because it describes in quite clear terms all this. I would recommend the reading, although it's a bit depressing in some ways, but it's quite well done, I think. An interesting point from this strategic review is that it put at its core the Russian threat, and with three dimensions. First one is, of course, the current war of aggression against Ukraine, with all the current and possible consequences for the security of Europe. The second one is the hybrid warfare that Russia is currently waging in Europe through cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation, etc. But the third point, I think, is more important and relevant to our conversation, is the prospect that it's likely to be a long-term challenge and maybe even a generational one. And this is important. I'll come back to that. And of course, there are other threats. And usually here in Italy, they are right to say, and we share this point of view, that there are other threats elsewhere, from the south, from Far East, from other places. So anyway, so of course, this is pretty much worrying. But then I would quote a famous Italian philosopher and writer, Gramsci, who said, as you remember, I'm a pessimist of intelligence because of intelligence, but an optimist because of will. So all this should be a call for action. That leads me to my second point. I think today in Europe, there's a general awareness on the need for action and for strategic autonomy. Just to turn back to this concept of strategic autonomy, a concept that we, France, we have been promoting now for a few years, it's always today probably widely acknowledged around Europe. And the idea is very simple. Well, simple to say, more difficult to do, is we need to be masters of our own destiny, which means to be able to make our decisions if circumstances require it, and also to act according to our own interests, which means, by the way, that we should be able to define what our interests, and I can tell you it's not that easy. But to avoid any misunderstanding, it doesn't mean it goes against the transatlantic alliance. It is very clear to all of us that NATO remains the cornerstone of our collective security, and second, that we need and we want to work with the US as much as we can. But it happens sometimes that our American friends and partners have other priorities and other interests. It might be circumstantial, this or that administration, but it is also more structural. And after all, the pivot to Asia started with Obama. So we have to take this into account. Third point, actually, we've already done much, we Europeans. It's very easy to say that, you know, we are lagging and we aren't doing what we should, but we've done much since especially the start of the war of aggression against Ukraine. And for example, in the field of defense, we've developed a number of tools. There's a tool, for example, called ASAP to buy ammunition for Ukraine. We have just put in place a mechanism called SAFE to allow for a joint for more investment in defense. We are just adopting in these days another instrument called EDIP. So we are investing at the European level in defense, and also we're investing at the national level. Of course, NATO adds some pressure on it because we have to reach some objectives. But today, across Europe, we're investing massively in defense. So that's good news. And in defense is true too in other fields, which are key for our future. And there is all this European agenda for competitiveness, for sovereignty, you know, dealing with the digital world, AI, or energy, or critical materials. And all this, you have initiatives. And also, there have been a number of ideas on the table. And thanks, by the way, to two former Italian prime ministers, Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi, which have laid out very clearly all the things we could do to improve, to reinforce ourselves, to strengthen ourselves, and to reinforce Europe's competitivity and sovereignty. So I would say now it's up to us to actually implement all this. And that leads me to my 4 points, which is that we need to do much more faster because time is of the essence. And I will mention 3 concerns that we should have. The first one, obviously, is just the speed, the need for speed. The others, yes, the others are running ahead. China, the United States, Gulf countries, other countries in Asia. And because we are Europe, because we are 27 countries, meaning 27 electoral cycles, but also we have a very complicated EU institutions, it takes a lot of time to actually do things. So yes, we need to act faster and to find shortcuts to do things quicker. But the second point on time is we have to be a bit careful not to jeopardize our long-term objectives with short-term decisions. Just to give you an example, defense. Today, we need to help Ukraine. So we need to buy weapons where they exist. So lots of European countries are buying American, South Korean, or Turkish weapons. Why not? They are there, they are available, they are good. But by doing so, in a way, we are increasing and not reducing our dependence. And all of us, we share the idea that in 10 years, 20 years, we should be able to be more autonomous. So how do we manage this dilemma between the short term and the longer term? So there are tools for that, and that's why we, the French, were in favor of a thing we call European preference. That is to, when we have collective investments, to actually invest in European capabilities and products rather than extra European ones. Of course, at the national level, if we want to buy South Korean or American products, it's everybody's choice. But our collective investment as European taxpayers should go to European producers. And the last point related to time management is that, as I mentioned earlier, the Russian challenge or the Chinese challenge are long-term challenges. So we need to maintain over the long term, over time, our political will, our unity, and our efforts, including our financial efforts. And that's not easy. First, at the political level, because sometimes we talk about the strategic awakening. But my guess is that some of us, well, probably not us, but some of us, would like to just press the snooze button and go back to a very comfortable sleep where we had the American protection, the Russian energy, and the Chinese products. This won't happen. Not because of us, but because the circumstances have changed in the US, in China, and in Russia. So we need to combat in some ways this risk of turning back to complacency and comfort because the world has changed. On unity, obviously, it's a daily effort at the European level, but we managed to do it. And about our efforts, obviously, there are other needs at the national level with health, with the education system, with innovation, and defense, of course, costs a lot. But we think that we don't have any other choice. My last remark quickly is about one aspect which was raised, which is a bit different, but in a way much more important, which is this notion of democratic resilience of our institutions. We are under attack, and liberal democracy is under attack. It's under attack from the East and sometimes even from other places. And through disinformation, through all kinds of evolutions which tend to weaken, corrode our democratic institutions. So there are a number of foreign interferences in electoral campaigns. It happened in France, it happened in other countries, most recently in Moldova, but at the same time, it's possible to combat it. And it's very difficult, but we have to work with the media, we have to work with education, with public opinion. We have also to react and not let the others attack us. But I think this thing is very important, especially for your generation, if I may, because we are entering into this world where truth is not anymore truth, where even science is under attack, and where our liberal institutions are being weakened. And I guess for us, Europeans, it's a lethal threat. Well, I will stop there just by quoting a French philosopher after an Italian one, Raymond Aron, who said in 1939, and 1939, of course, was on the edge of disaster. We believe in the ultimate victory of democracies, provided they want it. And I think that's the key word. That's really a matter of resolve. Thanks.
That's what I'm going to say. Thank you, Martin. Now, I'm hoping that we can get Antonio Villafranca to speak to us from somewhere in the ether. Are you there, Antonio?
I'm here. I wonder if you can hear me. Maybe you cannot see me. I can see you.
There you are. We can both hear you and see you. So
thank you.
You're not yet something out of artificial intelligence.
No.
Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'm very sorry I cannot be with you in person, but I'm glad to be remotely connected to you. Tony, let me put it this way. I mean, in the European Union, we are fond of buzzwords. A few years ago, it was soft power. We were very much in love with, being, the word soft power. Nobody really understood what it means in terms of regulation or whatever. But, we realized that, especially, one guy, Putin, made us realize that, soft power, yes, it can be important, but first there is security, hard power. Then we change, from the concept of soft power to the concept of strategic autonomy, which for me, as an analyst, as an academician, is a very vague definition. What does it mean, to be strategically autonomous? It's something that also in political science, you cannot find as a category, what it should be. So it's a very vague concept. But the bottom line of all this is that when it comes to security, we have to be very frank and say that we are still very much dependent on the NATO. That's why we are so much preoccupied, of course, our relations with the Trump administration. When it comes to economy, well, the situation is a bit better for the European Union, but to some extent. Let's consider, for instance, one field in which the European Union is supposed to be strategically autonomous, which is trade. Simply because, if you read the treaties, of course, competencies on trade have been given to the European Union. So, for instance, when it comes to the tariffs, Trump's tariffs, negotiation was correctly and wisely made by the European Commission. But what is, the effect of all this, of this negotiation? Well, we have to put very clearly that, these tariffs from Trump have no economic rationale behind that. There is no reason for the European Union to have these tariffs. Trump is right when he said, for instance, that before his second mandate, the tariffs applied by the United States to Europe were very low. The trade-weighted tariff of the European Union before Trump #2 was 1.2%, which is very low. But he forgets to remember that the European Union tariffs to the United States, which were even lower, 1.9, 2.1, 1.9, okay? And he also forgets another thing, okay, which is, it's true that we have a huge trade surplus, especially Italy, Germany, but also to some extent France, against the United States. Overall, last year it was 240 billion dollars. That is, our trade surplus with the United States. But Trump forgets that, for instance, we have a significant deficit when it comes to services. Every time we watch a TV series on Netflix, basically we are buying an American service. And last year it was over 100 billion euros. So, the rationale behind Trump's tariffs is very weak. If my students at the university explained, tariffs the way Trump did it in April with the famous board, I would say, okay, go back and start from page 1 on any handbook of macroeconomics, okay? Because it doesn't make any sense. There is no rational behind that. So what would you expect from the European Union? Of course, negotiation did their best, and now the average trade-weighted tariff of the United States to the European Union is 12.5%, which is very, very high. A really autonomous European Union would have done something, really groundbreaking, a groundbreaking initiative. For instance, striking new deals with third countries. You would expect, for instance, a different attitude towards China, but it's not going on. It's not taking place. Why is it so? Because if you take, the tariffs applied by Trump to China, they are even higher than the ones they are applying, to the European Union. What is the outcome is that in the first 6-7 months of the years, the number of goods, the Chinese exports to the United States decreased by about 20%. So, Trump is successfully reducing the trade deficit of the United States against China. But these products of China must go somewhere else. They are producing all these goods. They are going somewhere else, including the European Union. If you compare the first 6 months of this year with the 6 months of next year, the increase in products we are importing from China is about 12%. So, that is not an option. We are already overflowed by products coming from China. Then there would be other countries, and we have 44 trade agreements in place in the European Union with third countries, okay? And we are really trying hard also to enlarge the number of countries with which we could have, a trade agreement, for instance, Mexico, Indonesia. We have something in the pipeline, which is the trade agreement with Mercosur, but we know that there are some problems. With India, there are negotiations going on. Negotiations should be closed by the end of the year. Still, we know it's not going to be easy at all. Okay, so even if we consider, the field in which the European Union is supposed to have, the greatest competencies, and we see in concrete terms what is the result of all this, we have to admit that our autonomy is very limited. Not to mention, of course, when it comes to security, maybe we can talk about it later because I think I took all the time I needed. But again, what does it mean to be strategic autonomy when it comes to defense? Are we really able to spend 5% of our GDP, as it was agreed with the NATO, by 2035? It's not going to happen in any way. This is simply impossible. Let me just give you this figure. If Italy spent, 5% of the GDP in defense, it would mean over 100 billion euros per year. The amount that Italy spends every year on education from kindergarten to the university is about 78 billion. So we would spend much more on security, on defense, than on what we spend on education as a whole. So we have to take into consideration this. And the real reason, and I close here, that we are so weak, also when we have the competencies, that is the case of trade, is because simply we are not considered abroad, externally, outside the European Union, as a real union, because everybody knows, and it's crystal clear to everybody, that we are divided internally, and enlargement, future enlargements, which I agree upon, by the way, in any case, they risk undermining the unity of the European Union.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to turn now to Salvatore tomorrow.
Hi, thanks a lot first to everyone being here. So to me, it's easy being here also due to time, because yesterday the College of Commissioners adopted the Commission Work Program for 2026. And the word there is independence, is the independence moment for Europe, is what President von der Leyen put forward. And it's really important to weight the word, because independence, and here I really agree with Ambassador Bagger, does not mean autarky. We're in Italy, where autarky did not work out, where autarky translated only in big social and economic issues in the 30s. So what does it mean, independence? It means acting in an open environment where you need to be able to confront with the other counterparts, and trying to do so always on the best level playing field that you could do. And of course, it's the ability of doing so and the willingness of doing so. And there, the European Union, so with the member states, is the way of doing that. As a general perspective, I will focus more on the strategic autonomy and actually connecting a little word that, at least in the European bubble, Brussels bubble, is most often is the open strategic autonomy, because the concept of openness and the concept of relying on what actually were just mentioned, the trade agreements that are the great strengths of Europe, is what give us even further strengths. Sometimes, and there was the discussion about pessimism of optimism, we should just acknowledge also the facts that the trade agreements of the European Union created jobs, created growth, and are the things that put us in the position, in a strong position vis-a-vis their countries. In the moment, there is always debate and discussion of the agreements with the US in this year, but few people discuss the agreement with Canada, with the great positive effect that had in the last years, the agreement that has just been made with Mercosur and Mexico, and what is upcoming with India. So the world is not only about US and China and Europe. You need to be able to act with everyone. You need to be able to act also with our southern border. For example, last week, there was the strategy for the Mediterranean, the new pact for the Mediterranean that the Commission is putting forward. It's doing a step back and going back to the economic issues. Strategic autonomy was key in the discussion that the report from former President Mario Draghi, and on the competitiveness compass put forward as a first political act by the college. Here we are three things that we have to take note of. The first is there is no strategic autonomy in this world if you do not close the innovation gap. If we are not able to innovate, if we are not able to tackle the issue of this acceleration of the world and having that policy follows at the same pace the technology developments, we are not going anywhere. And here in the Commission Work Program for next year, there will be the 28th regime, so allowing companies to have a common business practice across the whole Europe. We will have a European research area that will allow the creation of what was envisaged in the report for former Prime Minister Letta on the fifth freedom, the freedom to research and innovate. And only if the guys are able to move, innovate, and see Europe as Americans see the US as a single entity, we will be able to close this innovation gap. The second part is connecting sustainability and competitiveness. The first mandate and the previous college was seen as a sustainability not connecting to competitiveness. First, this is not true, because when there was the first real crisis, the COVID, there was the creation of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which, let's remember, is an instrument to create growth, to sustain competitiveness, to sustain and push the Green Deal with over 40% of spending of the over 650 billion in green products and services. But most importantly, is also a way of really showing strategic autonomy, building also. It's true that we should not be in the interdependencies with the third countries can provide weaknesses, but inside Europe provides strengths, because that was the first act of solidarity where we had countries from Northern Europe really contributing to sustain the economies of Mediterranean, Southern Europe that were mostly affected at the time. The second act of solidarity of the previous college is when you had an issue with the eastern border and there was the using REPowerEU, so an instrument to ensure that the energy crisis will not affect Europe and to be able to maintain the prices and ensure availability of electricity and energy in Europe. But what is pushing and looking forward? This was not enough. What it was done is that there was to need to have more predictability. So the first thing is clean industrial deal, ensure that what were temporary help to enterprise to the temporary crisis and transition framework became stable and permanent. So support to the companies investing in sustainability and providing more tool for financing, a new way of seeing financing. Here is why the Commission proposed for the next budget a competitiveness fund. So a fund where we could be able to invest together more easily with a better governance, because there will be a competitiveness coordination tool putting the Commission with member states together and allowing to decide who want to follow on certain technologies. And this allows a further direction of ensuring that we are building all this together. And most importantly, this is not based only on the either research or manufacturing or a single step of the value chain, but it tries to put all together. So from the research on Horizon Europe to the investment that could be done together in manufacturing, and so building up higher competitiveness. The last step is Global Europe. This is Global Europe is a response that it comes also to ensure and strengthen European economic security. So is working together. There are discussions with the Americans, but we had with the previous mandate also the Trade and Technology Council, and there with them there are important discussions with the Americans that we still have on ensuring global economic security to work on specific sectors as AI, chips, critical raw materials. And on this is what we have to still work together as Commission member states to have projects inter-countries and to continue to be as a reliable partner. Thanks a lot.
Now, can Nicola Varela hear me? Are you there?
Clear and loud.
Very
Hello.
good. Very good. From the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Director of European and International Trade Policy. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Tony. Greetings from Brussels. I think we should, while discussing strategic economy, we should start from the current political juncture. The new normal of international relations is that competition is more and more geoeconomic. We have realized in the last few years that interdependence can be weaponized with forms of economic coercion. We have realized the hard way during the COVID crisis and the energy crisis in 2022 that dependencies can turn into vulnerabilities and can be leveraged to obtain gains. So this covers one of the W's of strategic autonomy, the why strategic autonomy, because the international environment has changed and we need to adjust. Now, what is the second W? What is strategic autonomy? I concur with Professor Villafranca that the notion is quite vague, but the idea was to more evocative than aimed at pinpointing a precise notion. We started discussing in the European institutions about this idea. We sometimes the European Council conclusion framed it as European sovereignty. Then we used the strategic autonomy, then open strategic autonomy. It's, as I said, it's more an evocative concept, but it's starting to take shape in practice rather than from a definitional approach. Okay, this is the strategic autonomy, and we need to follow suit. We are defining step by step what does it concretely mean. In broad term, I would say that it's something different from autarky. That's why we like to add open strategic autonomy. It's more about being able to function with the others, maximizing the upsides of interdependence and minimizing the downsides. So being able also to fend off for oneself, if you want, not only, but while keeping on working with the others without throwing under the bus the interdependence and working with the other economic partners. Now, the nature of this notion is really complex, I would say, multi-layered in a way. There is a military side, being able to produce more security, also strengthen the industrial base, the European industrial base, and being able also to have some European enablers in order to be able to act with the partners within the framework of NATO whenever it's possible, but also being able to function alone when it's necessary. But then there is a broad area that can be labeled as economic strategic autonomy that is at least as important as the political/military side. What is about technology? We are lagging behind in some strategic sector, so we have to make up for the loss of competitiveness in some very strategic sector, digital, artificial intelligence, chips, you name it. So this is an effort that has been mentioned by my predecessor to make up for this and for this loss of competitiveness, which is also strategic because this is, you could call it technological strategic autonomy. We need to be at least partially independent in several fields and being apt to cope with the international competition, to value the value chains, but also to not being liable to being blackmailed or coerced from an economic point of view. So we need to develop technologies and capacities in this field. There is a side that is about resilience. So strategic autonomy is also being resilient from the point of view of the infrastructures, of the material, the supply of earth, and the discussion we are having in order to make sure that we are not fragile, that we are resilient and able to function even if problems occur. And another side of the strategic autonomy is able to respond. We have developed an anti-coercion instrument. We have trade defense tools because we are in favor of the interdependence. We are in favor of globalization, or at least international cooperation. We are in favor of international value chains, but we don't want to be taken advantage of, because if somebody doesn't play by the rules,
We are losing you
play
a bit, Nicola.
by the rules, then you are taken advantage of. So you have to be able to respond to unfair or disloyal practices. And this leads to the tools we are adopting in order to be able to defend ourselves.
I think,
and then there is also,
Nicola, if it's okay, I think I might ask you.
Sorry?
I think I might ask you just to hold your thoughts
me?
there for the moment. We had a little bit of difficulty with the sound. So, but we'll come back to you immediately with once we've got some questions from the audience going. So thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. I was very struck by Martin's remark that you know, we could be looking here at a generational challenge, something that goes on. I mean, this is going to be of great interest to you, I think, in the audience. You might be looking at this as the single most important issue of your lives, really, just as for people like Thomas, myself, it was the Cold War. And it brings me to Thomas's reminiscences of the 1980s. And there are similarities, but there are also some really interesting differences. I lived in most of that decade in communist countries, Poland and the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, but got to know the whole region. And the one of the things I felt sure about was that no matter the level of hostilities, I was part of an alliance system, namely Western Europe and the United States, Canada, that was technologically far superior. I mean, you couldn't possibly doubt it as you walked around the streets of Moscow or any other city. And that gave a certain reassurance. That, of course, is not so true now. As we've heard from each of our speakers, there's a certain lack of competitiveness or falling behind in Europe now. The other thing that's different and possibly more worrying now compared with the 1960s was, in those days, China wasn't aligned with the Kremlin. Indeed, the Americans in that era designated China, I think, a kind of friendly, non-aligned country, and there were technology transfers, even some limited amount of military aid. So the kind of balance of broad international forces was again sort of on the side of the West. That doesn't seem so true now. Anyway, with that, let me open the floor to questions. So anybody who wants to, just raise their hand. And let me start with the lady in the second row here.
Hello, my name is Ipek. First of all, thank you so much for your speeches. I am an international student here in Rome from Turkey. And my question is mostly related to kind of a mixture of innovation gap in the European Union, hybrid warfare, and critical raw materials. As European Union is experiencing a innovation gap on AI, chips, and quantum technologies, European Union is in need of great resources for critical raw materials in order to innovate in these technologies. But we have been seeing a great investment of US and China, especially in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. US through Ukrainian Critical Raw Materials Act and China's investments in Serbia, for example. As China and the US is sharing Eastern Europe, which has most of Europe's reserves for critical raw materials. How should the European Union be navigating their relationship between US and China in order to get a part of the reserves and therefore improve their innovation? Thank you.
Who knows most about rare earths and the supply chains connected with that? I can let me we'll start with Salvatore.
I will give it a go quite quickly, because it's true that the issue is more and more prominent, but this is one of the sectors where the European Union already acted with the previous mandate. We have a Critical Raw Materials Act that is looking forward to enhance in Europe not only extraction capacity, but also the possibility to have a processing power of, because you need to have the working on the raw materials and the reusing the market. And the third part, which people always forget, is the reuse. Europe has a great strength in the reusing, in the circular economy, and there will be even a Circular Economy Act, and then we have to use it. There, the strength is simple permitting across Europe, working and having the certain resilience criteria in public procurement. Therefore, if you see that you have an excessive dependence with one country, you don't close to all the countries, but you push towards the others in order to push and strengthen a diversified economy. Working with the countries with the critical raw material partnerships, we have more than 9 partnerships in the world. Of course, you have to be conscious of each parties that are the specific political, economic and social issues, and there follow, because you have agreements with Australia, you're working with the Mercosur and Latin American countries. So the issue is high on the agenda. We already have a regulation and a way to act. Now is the time of implementing it. So do not be scared to even do extraction in Europe. There is nothing bad in doing certain activities, maybe better to do in Europe than elsewhere, and strengthening a value chain by working also with international partners. So doing processing in Europe, also inter-countries. I hope it helps.
Can we take a question from the front row here?
Thank you very much, all of you. It was so interesting. My name is Theodore. I'm from France, and I had a question for you, Mr. Ambassador. How does France view its current position in agricultural production, given the competition within Europe? And how can Europe ensure its agricultural autonomy while signing international agreements like the Mercosur one, which could expose European products to unfavorable competition, particularly rewarding environmental and sanitary standards? I understand the opportunities, as you mentioned, but where is the balance between opportunities for new jobs, more attractive prices, and our autonomy in this field? Thank you.
Well, thank you. No, it's quite a complicated issue, obviously, because agriculture in Europe is faced with a number of challenges. Climate change, we shall not forget it. The technological advances, and which is more an opportunity than a risk. And also, yes, competition. And a notion we've discovered or rediscovered is the notion of also agricultural sovereignty. That is the idea that as far as food is concerned, we need to make sure we have what we need. In the case of France, there's an additional dimension, because France is exporting agricultural products, and it's part of our trade policy. So we have to find the right balance between all this. And yeah, I would add a last objective in France too, which is the territorial dimension, because agricultors are actually how could I say, they manage vast spaces, rural communities, and so there's also, it's even more than an economic and an ecologic challenge. It's also really a very concrete territorial challenge. So we have to manage all this. It's very difficult. And by the way, among farmers, there are very different categories. You have some very small farms we don't have actually the same problems as vast companies with huge capital investments. So we have to deal with all of that. We have to find the right balance. And for us, you know, the challenge we have ahead of us is the reform of the common agricultural policy, which is going to come. We'll have the new financial framework, which is coming up. And we have to ensure that in the way we adjust this common agricultural policy, we can actually find the right balance, which will allow us to reach those 5 objectives. And this is obviously going to be tough because not all European members have the same interests, but what is true for agriculture is true for all the other areas. So we've seen with all this debate about Mercosur, we've been really at the core of it because on one hand, we are an exporting country, so we are very open to having a free market with our friends from Mercosur, and at the same time, we don't want to have an unfair competition in the field of agricultural products. So I can feel that the agreement which has been recently reached, which will add some safeguards, will allow us to adequately find the right balance in terms of agreement with the Mercosur.
Antonio, you'd like to come in here, I think.
Yes, I would like to add something about the question which was made on innovation gap of the European Union when compared to China and the EU. Well, I think that we know perfectly what the recipe should be to enhance the competitiveness of the European Union. You already mentioned the Draghi and Letta's report, and the European Commission is doing really its best. I mean, there was also the representative here. He reminded also many acts that the European Union is trying to do. The point is that the European Union, the European Commission, is not fully supported by member states. Because we have to again be very frank. In order to be competitive and to fully implement the Draghi and Letta reports, we don't only need the regulation, we also need money. We have to invest. We have to invest a lot of money. Draghi calculated that we need 800 billion euros per year. It is already, an estimation of the past, because if you take inflation, if you take also what we are spending on Ukraine, it's over 1 trillion per year. But the point is that we don't really need this money coming from states, coming from public coffers. I mean, we have to unlock the potential of private investment. And again, member states, some states in particular, let me just mention one, just not because I'm obsessed with that one, but one I would like to mention. Luxembourg, for instance, is one of the countries blocking the capital union. The result, we just had here at ESP a lunch with Commissioner Albuquerque of Financial Services, and she reminded one thing which is included in the Draghi report. Every year, 300 billion euros of European savings go to the United States, simply because it's easier to find a better interest rate and remuneration in the United States. It's much easier than the European Union, in which there is a very much fragmented, capital market along national borders. Just to give you an idea, if you consider, the barriers that we have inside the European Union when it comes to financial services, and you compare it to the barriers they have in the United States, it's 1 to 7. I mean, in Europe, we have 7 times more barriers than you can find in the United States. So in a situation like this, of course, the thing that we can do is try to increase, for instance, the European budget, which means public money. Okay, and there is the ambassador of Germany. We know the European countries are not very keen to further increase the EU budget, and to some extent they are also right. The proposal of the European Commission for the new multi-annual financial framework is basically to double, the EU budget, which is very much consistent with what Draghi said. I mean, this would suffice to the extent we are really able to unlock the potential of private investment. And so far, capital union is just, on the paper, but it's not something that we are really implementing anytime soon.
Yes, thank you, Antonio. Another question? Over on the right.
I'm Sofia. I'm an Italian student. Thank you very much for your speeches. I would like to ask you something about the relationship between the European Union and the United States, since you, basically all of you mentioned that. So you talked about the dependence that the European Union partially has from the United States, which sometimes, especially in this period, represents a problem because of the tariffs imposed by Trump and this administration. Which of course for us is a challenge for the European Union. And for sure, Trump had his reasons for fixing these tariffs. But I would like to ask you if at a certain point, we will find ourselves in a situation in which also for Trump, it would be a challenge. I mean, if limiting the importations through the tariffs will represent a challenge also for the United States and not just for the countries exporting towards the United States. I don't know if I made myself clear. Or that's okay.
I'm going to put this on to Thomas. I think the basic idea behind the question is, could Trump's tariffs turn out to be self-defeating for the American economy? And then he removes them, we're all happy ever after.
Yeah, it's a good question, and most professional university economists would probably say yes, indeed. It's bad for American consumers. It's bad for the American economy over time. But I think one of the puzzling points about the transatlantic relationship, or the role of Trump's America in the world, is that a lot of the things he does can actually work because it's America. So he sort of upends the rules, and he goes against the conventional wisdom, but it works because a lot of other players sort of fall in line because you don't want to in the end, or you can't afford. You evaluate cost and benefit, and then you say, we can't really afford to confront the United States. So we'll find some way of accommodation, even though we think economically it makes absolutely no sense, not just for us, but also not for them. So I think one of the important things, because we discussed what Europe could do and should do, Europe, the United Europe, is a very different animal than the United States. And the US can do things because it is the United States, because it has unique leverage, unique military power, a unique capital market, as we just heard. The Europeans in this age were 27 in our union. On most questions of real importance, we need to build a consensus. That's a great job program for diplomats because you need a lot of them. In the US, they think they don't, because if you have a single center of decision and everything flows from there, there's not that much to negotiate. But among us, 27, there's constant negotiation going on. But I think the most important difference that I can think of is that if you're an American and you decide to define America's interests very narrow and very short term, America first, and the only thing I'm interested in is the next year or the next 2 or 3 years, you know, we may think that's unwise, but it can still produce some reasonable outcome for America. If we would follow a similar approach in Europe, and every member state in the Union defines its own national interest in a narrow and short-term way, then there is no Europe anymore. Because the space for compromise, which is what we do all day long in Brussels and in our union, the space for compromise will shrink and it will disappear. And then all of the 27 are on their own. So I think that's the fundamental difference. What may work for the United States will not work for Europe. It cannot work. We're different. We're not just a product of a different geography and history. We're a different type of making decisions, coming to decisions that will define our own future. So it's much broader than your tariff question, where I think we look at things that come out of Washington that we find puzzling or detrimental also to US interests. But what we really have to worry about is our own ability to make decisions as 27 in order to shape our own future. And there you have a tension that Antonio also mentioned, where, you know, we're a complex, fragmented continent trying to pull together at a moment of urgency. That's quite a challenge we have. So it's more than a policy challenge. It's also the politics of it are much more complicated in Europe.
Nicola, would you like to come in on this question?
Well, not so much to judge on the impact on the United States. It's not, I would say it's not, I'm not in the business of commenting the policy choices of other states. I don't know. Some economists say it could be self-defeating, but it's quite clear that the Trump administration has a set of goals, among which there is to rebalance the trade balance, and they feel like tariffs is a good way to pursue this goal. We are not very much in favor of these tariffs in general, because tariffs are an element of attrition to the international trade, and we are very much in favor of international trade as a mechanism to create wealth, but this is a choice of the government of the United States. What I can tell you at this stage is that we were, I'm talking about Italy in this case, very much in favor of having some kind of deal to stabilize the relationship and to provide certainty to our enterprises. So we are not enthusiastic about the deal. Nobody drank champagne. I'm sorry, Martin, but we didn't to celebrate the deal. But we probably made a sigh of relief because it provided certainty and avoided the risk of a trade war between Europe and the US that would be very detrimental to our economic and also political and geostrategic interest. So not an ideal deal, but a reasonable deal that has the advantage to provide certainty and to make sure that our companies can continue to operate in a stable way. Actually, the data we are having from transatlantic trade flows is pointed the fact that the impact is not so dramatic as some people might have expected. So somehow we can metabolize in a way these tariffs. As I said, nobody say the kudos, we got a deal with the 15% linear tariffs, but it was reasonable. And I have to add one element, having dealt extensively with these trade negotiations with the Commission, of course, that Commissioner Šefčovič managed to strike a deal which is better than the other deals that have been made by the US in this field. So, well, I wouldn't dwell too much on this because I should enter into the details, but it's a better deal than other trade deals that have been struck by the US administration in this period. Of course, there are elements that are still need improvement. We have a big issue with steel and aluminium. We have issues with some fields that could deserve exemptions, but I don't want to bother you with those details. There are things that need to be worked out and implemented in this agreement. But to paraphrase Churchill, probably it could be labeled as the worst outcome possible, except all the others. So we can live with that, and as I said, we can make a sigh of relief in saying that, okay, now we have a stabilized situation, and the trade row between the US and Europe didn't spiral out of control.
Yes, the other thing Churchill said was keep buggering on, which was a kind of informal way of saying keep trying, even though it's difficult.
Tony, may I add one thing?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. First, let me say that I totally agree with Mr. Verola. I mean, the biggest problem for European companies in June, July was uncertainty. So at least we know now, what are the terms. Okay, but let me answer also the question from the student. She said, I mean, are these tariffs taking their toll on the US? Well, partially, yes. The answer, because when it comes to tariffs, we don't have to forget that there are three different actors which can pay those tariffs. The exporter from Europe, for instance, you lower the cost of your product, otherwise your product will not be competitive in the American market. The importer and the consumer. So now who is going to pay the most? It depends on the sector. There are, preliminary data that we are collecting, and it really varies a lot depending on the sector. But the real question is, I mean, what is the toll that it is taken to the US economy? And let me just remind you that, in January 2025, so last January, the IMF predicted, the growth of the United States was at 2.7% for this year. Now we are about 1.5, 1.6. So it's already taking its toll. It's not necessarily a bad news. In any case, the United States are growing even much more than the European Union. And, to some extent also, it's a good news for inflation. So why Trump is doing it? I mean, there is one clear-cut explanation for this. And last year, the revenues from tariffs for the United States were about $80 billion. Okay, this year they are going to be $300 billion. So it's a $220 billion more that they are getting through as a revenue through the tariffs. It's a large, a good amount. Okay, and he needs this money because Trump is increasing the deficit of the federal budget. Every year, the deficit of the United States is $1.8 trillion. Through the One Big Beautiful Bill, he is further increasing the public spending of the United States every year by from 400 to 600 billions per year. So he needs this money because of the time span he's considering, which is, the long-term interest of the United States, but the mid-term, very close, or at most, at the longest, the next presidential race in the United States.
Okay, thank you. And we can possibly squeeze one more question, and if anybody's got one, over here.
Thank you for being here and sharing your perspectives. You said we could purchase weapons from Turkey, and as a Turkish person, I find it difficult to understand. When it comes to European Union accession, we are considered the least reliable partner, yet on the matters, European Union has partially failed. For example, arms procurement, we are suddenly portrayed as the most dependable and compatible partner. I couldn't help but wonder what explains that dilemma.
I'm going to put this to Marta. It's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, the importance of Turkey in some ways has increased because of these various guys, but the question of accession to the European has kind of disappeared way over the horizon, hasn't it?
Well, obviously, that's a long-term question from the past, and we'll see about the future. Now, what is quite extraordinary about Turkey, I must say, is the way Turkey has developed in the past few years a whole new arms industry, quite innovative, especially in the field of drones, which in a way is a shortcut to, some capabilities. And it was quite amazing to see, in a way, Turkey led the way on the drone in the drone field. Now, obviously, it's been, other actors are coming in and quick and strongly. So the competition in that field is increasing. But it's true that in a way, Turkey has enjoyed a competitive advantage over the past few days on this type of capability. And that's why a number of actors and countries have decided to buy this kind of equipment that, that's, as I said before, you should take what is available, especially if you have an immediate security need. After that, it's a matter of choice, a choice from Turkey, which is a sovereign choice, what they tend to do. To become part of the European Union means not only, rights, but lots of also commitments and constraints. And so you have to delay part of your sovereignty. You have to accept hundreds and thousands of regulations. It's a community, and that's why enlargement, broadly speaking, is very tough, and it takes years, and it's very difficult, and it's frustrating often. We can see it, with some partners. We've been waiting for years and years and years. So it's not an on-off, situation. It's really a very, very long-term process, and that's the way it is. So we'll see about that. I mean, the fact that Turkey is a very active member of NATO is certainly a great advantage for all of us collectively. And so after that, the EU is another story, because the EU touches all the fields of public policy. And so it's also up to Turkey to decide, whether it's worth, having in some ways, a restriction on its own sovereignty or not. And then the other thing, but it's more from the EU side, and it's not about Turkey, it's about enlargement, broadly speaking, is also the eternal question about at which stage you're so many that you cannot decide anymore. So we are facing this because the prospect is in the next few years to have even more EU members. And that from the point of view, strategic point of view, it's certainly the thing to do, because to avoid that they get, swallowed or attacked by Russia. But at the same time, we know that with an EU with 35 members, it's going to be way more difficult to take decisions. So anyway, we are. I must admit, we are a little bit in the middle of the road on this. So we have to be very pragmatic.
I'm going to leave the last word on this point. I'll take it to Thomas. Thomas, you spent quite a while in Turkey, didn't you?
Well, I spent 4 years of my life and career in Ankara in the early 2000s, but it was a very different period. And interestingly enough, it was very much about a certain idea of the future. It was the United Europe that felt it was representing the future, and that was a sentiment that was largely shared in Turkey at the time, in the early years of the Erdogan government. And so this whole push for Turkey to become a member was much stronger, and it had some transformational effect also on Turkey. But in a way that got lost over time, and you can have long debates on was the carrot not fresh enough for Turkey, or did the Europeans sort of close the door too much for Turkey? Whose fault is it? But I won't get into that. I will echo what Martin has said, and said, in many ways, Turkey has had a quite impressive development since then, and the arms industry is only one example, including the drones. And on a very different level, Turkey has rather moved away from Europe when it comes to the way it governs its own society. It runs its own society, it runs its media and so forth. And so the distance has rather grown. And I agree with you that there's a certain tension there, but that does not inhibit cooperation in NATO. It does make EU membership actually more a very distant prospect.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, I think we've pretty much used up all our time. So I'm going to wrap up proceedings now. Thank you very much for all your questions. Thank you too to all of the panelists, the 2 out there and the 3 in here. And with that, a good afternoon to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.